All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. We're in for a treat and for this CRADLE seminar this afternoon. My name is Rola Jowie. I'm an associate professor of educational.
Okay, just lost the sound.
And you get to hear me in Duo, which is not great. I've gotten rid of that. All good. So we're joined today by Professor Laura Czerniewicz and Dr. Sarah Lambert, who will be talking about diversity in research and scholarly publishing. Just while everyone is joining us, I might just do a bit of housekeeping and then introduction to country. So just to start with, we'll be taking questions on Slido. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into there. I think Joe has added the link into the chat. Of course, also feel free to use Twitter. If you want to talk about anything, you can also use the chat function on the YouTube. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. First, we have Professor Laura Czerniewicz, who is the Director of the Centre for Innovation and Learning and Teaching at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. She's worked in education in numerous roles, and her research interests include the changing nature of higher education in a digitally mediated society, changing technological practices and digital inequality. She's committed to growing a counter-narrative of what is possible for higher education with her latest critical work for higher ed to resist research, regulate and reimagine. It sounds incredibly interesting and relevant to the work that CRADLE does. Dr. Sarah Lambert is an equity researcher. She's a colleague and a friend, I'm pleased to say. Sarah's recently finished her PhD and to great acclaim and was one of our first PhD students to finish at CRADLE. She is the co-lead for the Ascolite Digital Equity SIG, and she's worked in open education programs and partnership after a career in technology-enhanced learning, including as an executive member of the Australian Council for Online and E-Learning. Sarah's recent research explores how online education programs can be reconceptualised as social justice actions to widen educational participation for underrepresented learners and communities. So there are presenters. Hopefully we've got a few more people who've joined us in the meantime. I'd also like to start by acknowledging country. As we gather for this meeting, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect the meaning of place, and doing so recognise the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. We acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging of all the land we work and live on, and their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. If you would like, feel free to add in the traditional owners of the lands on which you meet into the chat box on either in YouTube or in the Zoom. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Sarah and Laura, who will be taking us through this journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rolla, and I'm very pleased to be speaking to you from Dja Dja Wurrung country up in regional Victoria, which has a very strong community presence, and I'm a recent settler here and very new and just getting to know some of the lands and waters here, which are very, very beautiful. They call it upside down country in language because the gold that was underneath has been pulled out to the top in the settler, the gold rushes, and there's quite a bit of remediation to do. But today, Laura and I have done a project together about social justice in publishing, and the topic of our publishing was also social justice in education. And so we're going to spend some time discussing that project and why we set about to do that, and some of the other kinds of works that we've done that sort of informed the way we did that. And then even before that, this seminar, the idea of it came when CRADLE asked me to present as a sort of post-PhD, but I felt I had presented quite a lot on the outcomes of my PhD and the publications on social justice in education from my PhD. So I said, I'm over that now. The publications are out there, and I'm moving forward into extending and deepening my understanding of social justice, and there's always a lot to learn. And I'd like to talk about this project that Laura and I have done to publish on social justice, and I learned so much through that process. But I'm actually really intrigued currently. What I'm interested in academically at the moment in terms of methodology is feminist methodology in educational research, and so I'm just reflecting on this project retrospectively, using some of the new things that I'm reading, and I hope that that's of an interest as a reflection on this project. So just to be clear, not that we didn't set out to do a feminist project, we did a social justice project, but I just thought it would be an interesting reflection bringing in this new what I'm reading at the moment. So I'm going to start off with a really neat quote from Living a Feminist Life from Sarah Lambert, which I'm reading, which really has some beautiful links to what we've done. But after those remarks, we'll move through to Laura on the politics of publishing. We'll get into the guts of this case study about our special collection, mentoring as participation parity, and then my reflections at the end on social justice and feminisms before we have time for questions and discussion. So that's the map of where we're heading. And so this is from, as I said, Living a Feminist Life, a really interesting book to read post-PhD when one wonders what is next. But think of this. Those of us who arrive in an academy that was not shaped by or for us bring knowledges that otherwise would not be there. Think of the kinds of experiences you have when you are not expected to be here, and these experiences are a resource to generate knowledge. So I think that the diversity of voices in publishing and the connection between that and generating knowledge is absolutely at the core of this giant project. So, Laura, would you like to take it away with the politics of publishing?
I'm very happy to do so, and greetings to everyone here from Cape Town. You can see that I have a university literally on a hill behind me, which is the University of Cape Town where I work. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics of publishing by starting to talk about this map that is in front of you, which shows the representation of scholarly publishing as per the Web of Science. And this map of the world shows the number of publications that very clearly demonstrates the extent to which the global north predominates, and the global south, that sort of piffly little balloon, which is Africa, does not dominate. And it's a very powerful way of exemplifying the northern-southern divide, which to some extent is about money, because research and dissemination costs money, but it's more than about money. It's about gatekeeping, and it's about hegemonies of knowledge, and it's about what kinds of knowledge are considered legitimate, and it's about what forms of knowledge are considered the kinds that count, what gets rewarded in the system. So perhaps you can go on to the next slide, Sarah. When we were thinking about this project, we were mindful that we were about to do a special issue. And yet, if we did a special issue on social justice and open education, we would need to think about representation. Who's invited to collaborate on these research projects? Who writes? Who publishes? Who is cited? I also had a lovely map that shows that citations form a virtuous circle of the global north. And there's a growing evidence base around publishing inequalities. And just two very powerful examples are a study in African Affairs, which showed that of the two top African studies journals over a 10-year period, that the number of African-based authors had declined, although the number of submissions from Africa had gone up. And that Africa-based authors were less frequently cited. This is bizarre. And the other example is development studies journals, which showed that fewer than 10% of papers in the 10 top development journals, development studies journals, were written or partly written by authors in developing nations. And in several cases, the editorial boards were entirely Northern representatives. So these are very stark examples. I think we can go on to the next one. So when we were planning this issue, we were mindful that there are examples elsewhere of participatory parity in scholarship. And participatory parity is not just an idle term. It's Nancy Fraser's term for her definition of social justice. So unlike open access publishing, which is about everyone having access to, this is about access into. And for us, the ability to participate in the publishing project is an act of social justice. So here are a couple of examples we'll mention briefly. The first is the Raw4D project, which was a massive project across the Global South, which is now recently ended, but all the outputs are still available on the Raw4D site. This is research on open education resources for development, which I highly recommend. And Sarah's going to mention another example.
Yeah, I've got a book chapter coming up that's been, as they always are, a long time in the making, that's about open education as a human right, and there's a number of case studies in there. And this one is about author aid, and the author aid program started off trying to address the kinds of inequalities in global North and South publishing, and to support writers and academics in developing countries to be able to self-represent their own stories, to get published in a mixture of journals, and to be able to advance their careers. So this one actually moved over into an online MOOC program, and part of that was when they piloted that, they noticed much better gender balance with that program. So it was quite successful at attracting and retaining and completing women who are underrepresented in higher ed and publishing as well, and also find it hard because of their caring roles to actually attend out of work hours sorts of events. So this particular case had mentoring, writing mentoring, and a whole lot of scaffolded support through a formal program as well. And so yeah, some interesting work happening to try and address the sorts of disadvantage in between countries and for particular kinds of people within country as well. So JIME. JIME is the Journal of Interactive Media and in Education. It's an open access journal, and it is done by the Open University in the UK, who of course have been proponents and leaders in open education for a long time, but are increasingly collaborating globally and encouraging that kind of collaboration. And so with the assistance of a small grant from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, Laura and I edited this special collection, and the address of that is there, and we'll share the slides for you so you can go and have a look at this special edition, which was put out in May 2020. So there were 12 papers, so that included the editorial, which was quite a considered piece, and 11 other articles. And that's a big special collection, often sized, they're normally around 4 or 5. So the funding allowed us to also additionally provide publishing of additional papers. And we were able to get a wide range, as we'll soon see, a diverse collection of 12 papers, different global contexts, new theoretical perspectives, and a broad range of cited authors. New frameworks for social justice were developed, new empirical advances and insights. So it was advancement of knowledge. It was really powerful, and all of the authors and editors really discovered other new authors from other parts of the world and with other perspectives, and theorists as well, through what became quite a shared project. And to give an example, this is a concept map of all of the theories on which the papers relied. You'll see top left Fraser's social justice model with its economic, cultural, political, or redistribution, recognition, and representation was quite strong, and that was directly or indirectly influencing many of the papers. But there were additional kinds of theoretical constructs from Thurborn, Grossfugel, Langer, decolonization, First Nations knowledge authority literature, as well as digital divide and social inclusion literature from other parts of Europe. So it was really rich, and we learnt a lot and were able to progress, I think, new frameworks, which is very exciting. Laura, do you want to speak to this next series?
Sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, when Sarah and I discussed doing the special issue, we felt that we would not be walking the talk, that we would be perhaps even hypocritical if we were to write about social justice without ensuring that the practice of putting together the special issue itself made a maximum effort to ensure the fullest participation in this special issue. And this did require getting a grant, because what we'll talk about, and I suspect there'll be questions about, was what does that actually take? And I'm hoping, I can't actually see the participants list, but I'm hoping that some of the authors were able to make this time zone permitting and can also speak to their experiences. So the first thing that we realized when we were working on this special issue, that we had to rethink our notion of peripherality. It seemed simple at the outset, if you look at that map, to imagine the global north and the global south, and we would simply write that skewed wrong. And yet, when we looked at the papers that were sent to us, and there were more sent us than were published, we realized that it's not actually so straightforward. So within the global north, there are universities and contexts which are peripheral. And within the global south, there are universities and contexts which are actually part of the dominant structures. So, for example, the University of Cape Town, where I work and where, in fact, we published a paper from, is one of the top 200 universities in the world, according to the Times Higher Education ranking. So it meets a whole lot of criteria that one might say is part of the hegemony of knowledge. And so we were forced to rethink what we meant by within and across the North and the South geopolitically. And we were also confronted with something we knew about, but I certainly hadn't expected to see, the impact of the precariat, the impact of the unsupported nature of academia and academic research due to the precariat. So if you go on to the next slide, you'll see that, in fact, what we had to do was ask people the ways in which they considered themselves peripheral, rather than us coming up with a neat set of criteria. And this really pushed the boundaries, because the notions of what were peripheral were included part-time or precarious work with high teaching loads, which is very typical of those kind of contracted positions. No support, often because of austerity climates, and not only in the global south, in the United States, in other parts of the world. no mentors or scholars, particularly around open education, but quite often a lack of mentoring per se. In some cases, people were new to the field, which is a more traditional peripheral role, and perhaps doing their PhDs. Some cases, it was about having a marginalized identity within their own institution. And in some cases, it was about being in a remote location. So in what happened in the end is we had 11 lead authors either from the global south or in a relatively peripheral country within their geographical region. So for example, Turkey or Ireland are not considered part of mainstream Western Europe, or in a regional or peripheral location within their own country, such as Darwin in Australia, or Pullman, Carolina, or the Channel Islands, or bilingual academics working in a different culture from their own backgrounds. 9 of the lead authors were women, and 3 of them were busy doing and publishing and writing their research. When it came to the politics of mentoring, we were mindful that mentoring involves unequal power relations, and mentoring has to be something that people want, feel ownership of, feel agency of. When it comes to who the mentors are, that's really important. Mentors are very often retired academics, and certainly because of the skewed history, retired academics are very likely to be part of dominant groups. So the power relations implicit in mentoring had to be very carefully handled, not only from our point of view, but from the point of view of the relationship between the mentors and the mentees. There were also the challenges of different contexts. So mentors came from one context and mentees were in a number of different places, writing with different stories, and that had to be negotiated. Of course, it was all online, and this was pre the pandemic, when this was not the automatic nature of everything. So there were a number of practical difficulties as well around time and around time zones and so on, which were to be expected. Just to give you a little bit of feedback from the mentees, one person said that the fact that the mentor was not familiar with the field was a positive element, as she was approaching the text with fresh eyes and was asking the right questions to bring more clarity into the text. I must say, someone else said the opposite, that she really liked the fact that the mentor knew the field. Another person commented that the mentoring went beyond this paper. So I feel that my mentoring experiences helped me more than I expected. While this mentoring aimed to improve my ideas and paper for the special issue, I feel it has also supported my writing and critical thinking skills. Someone else commented very clearly on the necessity of getting the communication right. So it worked because we communicated, but I can see it going wrong. Someone else liked the fact that she was pushed. I feel that the mentor saw my potential and was pushing me to level up. I knew I needed help, but I wasn't sure what I needed to do in particular. And then several people commented that the most problematic aspect was time constraints, which was, I would imagine, to be expected. And the next slide. What actually happened was some of the things were to be expected. So the kinds of issues that were addressed were the usual dimensions of academic writing, argument, language, usually around argument, sometimes strengthening theory for some people, an aspect of social justice, the kinds of theoretical landscape that Sarah laid out was not always known or explicit. And the editor's role was, as you might expect, although I think Sarah in particular went the extra mile in terms of, in fact, playing a mentoring role herself. But there were unexpected aspects, which were that we had a number of experienced authors asking for mentoring. And it was really striking that even established authors always value having a critical friend or a critical engagement. And then I think the thing we hadn't quite anticipated, and perhaps that was simply we haven't done this enough, although I've done a few of these special issues, was the extent of work post peer review. So the mentors did a lot of work preparing the papers for publishing. But in fact, once the reviewer comments came back, they really asked for another whole round of work. So I think if we or anyone else does this again, that's something to bear in mind.
I might just chip in that we asked for extended abstracts as part of the process that we took directly, and those we asked them to address the theoretical concerns and underpinnings of their proposed study and so on. And so we were able to, as editors, provide some feedback on the theoretical approach actually from the beginning, and some of those conversations then carried forward as the work was developed, and so there was that sort of additional mentoring happening there, but that was really useful and commented on as well. And that was before then we accepted and asked for, so we had 25 submissions and we ended up taking 11, saying to them, yes, please produce the full manuscript, and if you've asked for mentoring, here is this opportunity. But yeah, the post peer review was, there's just so much great feedback, which is a nice problem to have, I suppose, but then really tussling with what that meant and how you could best interpret it, I think was where some of the really rich conversations happened. And yes, the experienced authors were still, I was also really surprised how, and I'm thinking in particular, these were women who expressed quite a lot of imposter syndrome progressing. They had reached a level but wanted to keep going, and there was always that uncertainty and that need to have someone with a different set of ideas to be able to move forward. And so it was a really interesting thing all round. Yeah. Oh, we're here already. How marvelous. I wonder, Paige and Joe, if you're in the background, or Rolla too, if we have time, I think we might, is there any questions about the mechanics of what happened that we could clear up before I step into this sort of more reflective section?
So far, hi, it's Joe. So far, I don't think there's anything particularly. John Okawole wanted to get his hands on the stats that Laura cited in terms of journals and publications from the Global South. But aside from that, I think there aren't any particular questions about the mechanics. Okay.
All right. Well, guess what? We go forward. So I guess I think social justice is a rich tradition of literature, and it was methodologically a critical studies sort of approach I took to my thesis. And then this project, the idea for it of really focusing on each of these sorts of representation and recognition elements within open education, to put a special edition out there. So I suppose it wasn't a surprise that there was a strong theoretical approach, and there was some really interesting theoretical contributions, and some of the mentoring therefore connected around different theories. And there were a couple of our authors who were threading existing frameworks together, for example, to develop more specific ones for particular contexts that they were investigating. So that was really rich, chewy stuff to get stuck into. And I think at the time, I was very much enmeshed in those different social justice sorts of readings and the sorts of theories to talk about that in a broader sense, and then how that's filtered down into the educational contexts. But post-PhD, I find it hard to know exactly where was the turning point. I think some of the research that I looked at had a particular gender and feminist approach. Many of the case studies and the sorts of problems in the sort of micro studies were drawing attention to the ongoing inequalities of women and gender, and feminism not solving everything yet and needing to be relooked at. So I think bit by bit, some of these issues are sort of creeping in. We've had the Me Too movement, of course, really re-energising, and some really quite shocking cases of violence against women in Australia, including a death on a university campus. So there has, I suppose, been a number of these sorts of things that have made me think about, you know, why is it that we don't talk about feminism so much? And is, you know, perhaps it is a good time to have another look at that. And in fact, I recall at the beginning of my thesis, really, when I was really reading through, and I had the same thing about social justice. 4 years, in 2016, there was nobody really strongly talking about social justice in the educational way that they are now. And so I think this is a parallel space of me sort of saying, well, you know, feminism, it seems to be much needed again. And although it may be unfashionable, you know, and nice to think that we are done with that, I tend to think that we're definitely not done with that. And so I think I've begun to read a number of feminist works and connect the dots to the social justice. And what I'm really reflecting on is the common ground. So social justice, looking at historical disadvantage and histories of disadvantage for different types of groups and identities, is often covering race and gender. So now reading about feminism, particularly the third wave feminism of Black feminism, what could be called intersectional feminism of race and gender. So I just had one of those pop moments. Why did I not choose to use a feminist methodology in my study? You know, to what extent are the issues of representation in feminism the same as what is happening in the literature and social justice? So I suppose this is the current sort of academic thought process. And I'm not too sure, because I'm just thinking about these types of things, but it seemed that with these, there were 9 female authors who expressed quite a degree of plurality in this publishing process. And I do think that we were able to really lift up the representation and challenge that sort of dominance and reimagine, to use Laura's term, what else publishing could be. And I think retrospectively, I'm considering this a sort of stronger feminist act than perhaps I intentionally embarked upon. And that is sort of helping me think about, if I was to do it again, would there be some additional strength through looking at that sort of literature? And refusal, it's a strong word, isn't it, to refuse to accept particular forms of oppression or sexism. I'm feeling like, yes, let us use this term, refuse, because we did absolutely refuse to just accept the usual suspects who can publish. So we refuse to accept that widening participation in academic publishing equals a reduction in quality. Absolutely, I think that one is just it's just an old chestnut that just keeps going round and round. But it wasn't a massive grant. It wasn't. I think we had 3 mentors. You know, it wasn't like a humongous project. It wasn't, you know, hugely unachievable, but the quality lift, the confidence lift, the lift in voice and strength in argumentation, you know, produced, you can't say that the quality wasn't there, but some of those, so shyly, the way some of those authors had, like, I'd really like to do this, but I'm feeling, you know, unsure and unsupported, you know, like it could have easily been a number of people not putting submissions in because they didn't have that confidence to speak, I think. So from the beginning, we made it clear when we launched the call that there would be some sort of mentoring opportunities. And I think this drew quite a substantial, you know, momentum and a number of people to the project that that was very useful. And I know, for example, the same journal ran a special edition on literature of open education from Latin America and worked really hard to have a very diverse plural call, but we're still only able to get 4 papers together at the end of that, and we were able to get 11. So I really think that the mentoring from the start was super powerful way to refuse to accept that this situation needed to be. And women and early career researchers and writers of colour, of whom we had many, have different experiences and can be translated into new approaches and new people to cite and new knowledge. And so I think we can refuse to perpetuate the idea that theory is difficult, which is another topic that Sarah Ahmed discusses in her literature, about theory being something that women are often sort of suggested that that's a bit beyond, that's something you might think of later. And the sort of virtuous circle, as Laura was saying, of citing is often white male theorists, particularly in some fields. So, we can definitely refuse the idea that theory is too difficult and is not something that those who are emerging can engage with and get support for. And in that way, we can refuse to accept that spaces of academic publishing cannot be made more inclusive. And we can also refuse academia as a competitive space. And these things are certainly really important to me, and I think to many of us. And I hope we might get some feedback on that. And in taking these sorts of views, I think there is a lot in the third wave or intersectional feminism that looks at the lived experience of the intersection of race and gender. And Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Kimberlé Crenshaw, and Flavia Zodina are authors who I'm beginning to engage with more thoroughly and cite. Of course, Nancy Fraser is a renowned white feminist, and I have been enormously enriched through those concepts as well. But I think it's important at the moment, and I'm interested in what it means to spend more time reading Black feminism and acknowledging the labour and work there. Flavia Zodin's work is been turned into memes and made into T-shirts for which she receives no money. Hers was the quote that said, feminism will be intersectional or it will be bullshit. And so that's a very firmly worded statement, but she has some strong writing in that regard, and that one's taken off. And it's quite an interesting story of how her own, most famous slogan is something that she's actually also been not cited by many white people. It's quite unfortunate. But we can do better, and we can, and I think want to do better in both men and women in the world we live in. And so I want to just finish this reflection again with a quote from Living a Feminist Life. And it is that living a feminist life, and this is my addition for men and women, as I have two feminist sons and I don't wish to exclude at all. But living a feminist life does not mean adopting a set of ideals or norms of conduct, although it might mean asking ethical questions about how to live better in an unjust and unequal world, and how to create relationships with others that are more equal, and how to find ways to support those who are not supported or are less supported by social systems, and how to keep coming up against these histories that have become concrete, histories that have become as solid as walls. So that's where I wanted to end today, and thank everyone for attending, and looking forward to some comments or questions.
Sarah, maybe I'll pick up on one or two things that you've said.
Yes.
Before we open things up, because I see that there have been a couple of comments around where knowledge sits and where knowledge is valued. And listening to what you've been saying about feminist theory, which I haven't read as widely as you have, I don't think that we would want to apologize for or reject someone like Nancy Fraser because she's a white American woman. I don't think that a new kind of knowledge engagement is a replacement. I think it's an addition, and I think it's a rejigging of power relations. And the writer and the thinker who's really influenced me in this regard is Achille Mbembe, who talks about pluriversal knowledge. And he talks about horizontal knowledges. And I think that really captures quite visually a different way of engaging. So how do we move from the central peripheral to a pluriversal, I can't say it, of knowledge that is a much more flattened structure where the power relations have shifted.
Yep, it's wider and deeper.
Yep, so I will put the link to Bembe talking about that up.
I agree, and I want to also position this as an additional lens, and I hope I've made it clear in my history of thinking that it's just, you know, we can't be exposed to all the ideas as we, you know, at any point in time, and as we progress, you know, hopefully our academic curiosity and our research curiosity, you know, and conversations keep widening us up. And I think the special edition did. There were some, I had not really engaged with Thurborn's concepts before, for example, even within social justice. So there's always so many holes in your own strange knitted sort of methodology. But it was curious to me, I suppose, how so many of those ideas around recognition and representation that are absolutely have been within the sort of feminist theory for a really long time, just it didn't occur to me at that other moment to cite and read that. So it was sort of a post hoc connection. I'm happy, very pleased to see the weaving together and the additions. You know, it's a thicker rug. I'm not putting aside the old rug. I'm knitting more onto it.
I wonder if there are any participants here who were our authors. I would really love to hear from them.
We do have some who've been active on the YouTube chat, and I wonder whether they would like to share any questions or thoughts or comments through Slido. We do have some questions on the which Jo can share, but I just wanted to start by saying thank you so much. It's funny just reflecting as a deputy editor of a prestigious journal, having had the conversation about genuinely wanting to improve diversity, but yet never actually taking the active steps that you two took in this special issue, and really what it would take for us to do that beyond merely an intention to. So thank you for giving me some actual steps and some thoughts around how we might do that in more successful ways. Yeah,
fantastic.
And lots of readings there for me to do. So I will, I don't know whether maybe if you want to, Sarah, although I love the quote, is to maybe minimize that slide screen, and then I'll give it over to Jo for some questions.
I think I'll have to stop the sharing before I can do anything else. So we'll just turn that one off and go back to heads. Okay, great.
Great. And I must also say thank you to you both for sharing your work and sort of encapsulating some of those ideas. And apologies for the background noise. There are a couple of questions on the Slido, and I'd invite any of our audience to keep on sending in questions. The first one there broadens it beyond just the sort of the editorial and the authorship side, but how might reviewing and publishing cultures become more actively and intersectionally just?
I mean, who you ask for review is certainly very interesting, and maintaining networks globally, I think, is the first, probably a good step. Well, it certainly helped me. I'm part of a global OER graduate network that has just representation on all the continents, and actively, you know, nurtured that network in terms of who we asked to send things out to review. And when I did send out too, I would say, hey, I think you'd find this interesting for this reason, but also this is a you know, this is a special collection devoted to social justice. We've got some mentoring. We're looking at, you know, parity of representation. So, you know, have you got time to you know, provide a constructive review. So I guess I just was also not shy about sharing the justice in our intentions, and I actually found that deepened the engagement with those who reviewed, and in fact it made the reviewing for them also more rich and meaningful a kind of work. So I think being clear in all of your message that this is the project you're doing, and maintaining networks and trying to find the link between the reviewers' legitimate interests and what is coming up the pipe, and being clear about the sort of constructiveness required. You know, we don't want to, having mentored, say, you know, a new writer to this point, we don't want to sort of give them a, it's not really good enough, but I can't tell you why, sort of peer review experience. That would not have helped, would it, Laura, at the end of the pipeline to get that sort of a problem. What are your thoughts, Laura, on the peer reviewing side?
I think there's there's intentionality that's involved, and I think it's easy to go with the networks that one has, and it's easy to go with the reviewers that are already on the database, and so it's a bit of a hassle. It takes some effort to find reviewers outside of the usual known spaces. It's the same for keynote speakers at conferences. There are the ones who are known. And I would add that it's not only about the reviewers, it's about the references within papers. There is an assumption about which are the papers that get referenced and quoted, and it's an act of intentionality. And this is something that Maha Bali has actually written about, and I hope she's here, because I would actually like her to add her link to thinking about references and different kind of references, and quoting different kinds of authors from different kinds of places, which are just as legitimate, just as robust. But it is an inconvenience. It does take some effort, and sometimes convenience is that drug, you know, it's the nirvana, it's the easy thing. And so for editors and reviewers and critical readers, it's a matter of asking people to ask people. Ask someone like me to ask someone for Emerge Africa, to ask someone like GoGN. There are networks that can be inserted. And one of the wonderful things, and I can't think of very many wonderful things, in fact, I can think of very few wonderful things, but one of the good things that's come out of this ghastly pandemic is that people have gone online and connected and spoken in ways that they were not comfortable doing. And this is an opportunity that I think we can exploit. So it can be done, but it takes a decision, some effort, and intentionality.
Curiosity helps, I think. If you can nurture your academic networks of people who are genuinely curious, then I think it really helps to maintain that intentionality through the review. And also, I just want to add that our topic is very cross-disciplinary. So already I think then we were saying things like, you know, look, I can't think of anyone exactly who's done a feminist review of this topic in open education, but let's just, you know, ask a feminist just to tackle this open education thingy, you know, like, let's not worry so much about that. Or there was one paper that was looking at a sort of second language teaching context. And so, you know, I asked someone that I had worked with who was an outstanding linguist, and they're not hugely, they're tech savvy, but they weren't, you know, core to open education, but theoretically that's where it existed. And they also found that really interesting to do, and they were a great reviewer. So sometimes I think the sort of theoretical approaches provide different sorts of review opportunities than the usual suspects, and that's part of the interesting learning experience that for me, this project was a learn as an editor, and the peer reviewers themselves said they learned, the authors, you know, learned it was gosh, we did a lot of learning. How are we going on questions?
You've got plenty. I don't know, Joe, if you look potentially frozen there. I'll pose a question and then we'll go over to Joe. We've got a question here from Margaret. Striking how political all our everyday academic actions become. How have you navigated this for yourselves on a daily basis?
Laura, do you want to throw some thoughts in?
Well, all I can say is I'm South African. So everything in South Africa is political on a daily basis. There is no getting away from that fact. And all I can do is agree with you, Margaret. It's true. Everything is political. All the small choices are political. And as I think, as Sarah was saying, as feminists, one becomes aware of that. But of course, these are social justice issues. They're issues of representation. They're issues of recognition, to use Nancy Fraser's terminology. They are indeed political. I can only agree with you there.
Yes, I think so too. And I think perhaps this project has been part of that expanding awareness as well for me. And so perhaps that is also one of the other reasons why I find myself reading, you know, Living a Feminist Life, because I'm asking myself, how can you maintain, you know, an authenticity to those beliefs without drowning? You know, how can you make progress and have some boundaries? And so I have very intentionally reading some of this feminist literature to ask myself, how can I maintain these important matters, and where can I best now apply them in the next project? So whatever that may be, which I yet do not know, but I really hope to find another meaningful way to enact those in publishing or in some research or academic practice, because it does seem useful. And also more broadly applicable to, you know, the daily choices we make in different spaces. So I think connecting with others who have the intention is probably one of the core ways to do that, because it produces like a touch point to keep your intentionality alive and to acknowledge and honour it, so that you feel continue to feel good about that, as you should. But not so good that you just give lip service and no action. It's a fine line, isn't it? I think Joe might be back.
She is. Joe.
I am back. Sorry for that slight technical interruption. Hopefully the technology keeps on working from now. Another really interesting question. Changing academic publication needs to start in research, training and publishing. So I guess at that earlier stage, what are universities going to do about it, and what kind of things can we look for there?
I'm inspired by some of the small presses that I am seeing emerge out of small academic consortia in the UK, at least, and wondering whether we might see an emergence of that in Australia as an alternative, legitimate way to produce quality publications that are open access, which we know tends to really, you know, track up the impact. And I use that term in the widest sense of more people being able to access it, use it, engage with it on lots of different levels, not just within academia, but within society and all kinds of schooling. But I'm certainly tracking that with interest. And I think that, you know, we need actual vehicles. We need journals with editors who are prepared to put statements out that say this is actually what we stand for. Now, there was, for example, in COVID, some early really scary data about the numbers of submissions by women plummeting, like ridiculous numbers of plummeting, and the assumption being there, which I think has been borne out in later sort of insight, that women are still hugely overrepresented in those who are just assumed to take up the caring and the schooling that was required because of COVID, and their inability to do this double and triple labour was meaning they were not producing the sorts of publications. Now, we had a collaboration, a feminist sort of collaboration coming together to come up with a statement of editorial judgment around that and what could be done. And then we've had a wave of journals adopting those sorts of statements. So I think it's an intentionality and an awareness. That's a really good step. So without that, you sort of are nowhere. I think there should definitely be some more of that, because we can't train students up to an environment where there is no opportunity. So we actually have to change the numbers of publishing vehicles that are able to work in this way, as well as then training people to be able to be review in this constructive way, and to build capacity for that for senior staff as reviewers, as well as for writers and editors and so on, and to give good reward for to putting into those systems, so that when people lift others up, they feel lifted up. Like, my career is at a level I don't need any more lifting up. I can just donate some of my labour towards lifting others up. This should be a thing that is itself recognised and rewarded, I think.
What I'm actually doing is I'm putting into the Slido a webinar that Ashil Mbembe is going to be giving on the 22nd of October. Because
nice.
when it comes to the question of new forms of knowledge, he is really the person to listen to. He's been studying decolonization of knowledge for many years. And this question about how do you actually change the forms of knowledge, which I see in the questions rather than the publishing processes, is of course at the heart of what we're talking about. And that's really about a broader project of decolonizing the curriculum, which means a lot of different things in different contexts. And I don't have the authority to talk about what that means in the Australian context, but certainly it's more than localizing, it's more than Africanizing in our sense. It's actually about changing power relations within knowledge and what kinds of knowledges count. So I think that the person who asked that is absolutely right. We've been talking about the taking the tail end, the knowledge dissemination process, but what's really at the heart of this is knowledge production.
Another, another question just popped up, but another one on this knowledge dissemination end. Most journals treat papers without regard to author or country to address some forms of bias and patronage. So why would you take your approach instead of the standard approach? And I think we've heard a lot about the arguments for, but if another editor were to say, well, why is your approach better for addressing bias? What would you say to them?
I guess it would depend on the journal and the stats. I mean, is it, show me the numbers. I mean, there are, of course, it's a lot of journals out there, and not all of them are individually looking at a sort of such misrepresentation or underrepresentation. So yeah, we can't out of hand say the existing system is a complete disaster, but there are quite a few voices that suggest that, yeah, I mean, even this, I'm just thinking there's literature out there that says that, for example, women are treated worse in peer review than men are. I remember reading that paper. So it was, even though that was blind, there was enough cues in the way that the writing was done and the topic to reveal the gender, and that the peer reviewers were much more critical of those perceived to be women than men. So there's a lot going on at the level of how hard one must work at as a woman or a woman of color to be published, and what topics are. I mean, for example, we've all had reviews come back where a reviewer's gone, look, this just isn't interesting. I just don't think this is interesting. This is just not something we're interested in this journal, right? And then, then someone who's powerful puts that in, and all of a sudden it's the cutting edge of knowledge. Like this stuff is unfortunately common. And I think that we have to, I think it takes a very confident person, to be honest, in a publishing space to say, yeah, our system rocks. You would have to have done some deep reflective work on your own privilege, the stats and the privilege and the way review is treated and who is published before I think you could step forward with confidence and say, look, we really have a system that is not reproducing the sorts of status quos. And if people can do that, then absolutely kudos to them. And I think some of these editorial boards who are coming forward at these times, making those sorts of statements and doing the stats are showing that yes, you can. So that's good.
I'd like to add to that too. I mean, I think that's such an excellent question. And I think it goes beyond the location and the positionality. I actually think it goes back to, well, what's wrong with having a dominant hegemonic knowledge discourse? And I think the world is much poorer for having a northern dominant hegemonic discourse. I think that everyone loses through that. I think that knowledge is much more interesting, much richer, much more complex. And having a knowledge system that prioritizes this one particular worldview is a loss to everyone. And so I think that's what it's actually about, is actually having a much richer world, a much richer access to a variety of knowledges and worldviews. And so that gatekeeping is a systemic kind of gatekeeping that prioritizes a particular worldview, which is extremely problematic. And I think that's a loss to everyone.
I think I'm doing some research at the moment in the Australian context on open educational textbooks and from a social justice perspective. And we're at that point of we're speaking about the content, not the cost of the textbook, but the actual diversification of the content. And so I've had academics in some particular professions say, look, gosh, we're just a white profession, like all of the founding knowledge is just these, white northern people. So we just have to teach that stuff. And I'm not really, aware if there's something missing. And then I've had other academics in the same profession say, look, I'm really aware what's missing and I'm able to address it in this particular way. So for example, in the business discipline, I've had some academics with awareness that they really want to introduce some of the Eastern Eastern philosophers into how you teach and think about business and economics, for example. There are plenty of examples, but yes, it's you're going to have to dig in and have that intentionality. But considering that so many of our students are coming from parts of Asia and Australia, certainly this is a sort of connecting and belonging benefit for the diversification of students that we have, as well as opening people's minds to new knowledge, as Laura says, which makes it a richer knowledge base rather than just one way of doing things. So I think psychology, philosophy, and business were the three disciplines that I've had some conversations with different sorts of awareness about whether or not one could question and through their teaching role introduce different sorts of knowledges and different people on the spectrum of we just have to do this, to actually no, we don't have to do this, we can actually introduce. And so yeah, it is definitely there's both sides of that perspective are very much happening in the Australian context. So yeah, I hope that this research can make that conversation a little bit more open. Yeah.
Can I just come in here to say thank you both. What I'm going to do is close up the formal proceedings for the CRADLE seminar because we have gone over the hour, but invite everyone who is still with us to stay on for another few minutes. We've got a couple more questions to go. I think what you gain with this format is all that chat in the backstage and the Twitter and, you know, all of that, but I think what we lose is you would have seen a lot of heads nodding, I think, and just some real at this thoughtful conversation. So I'll give you lots of head nodding in lieu of all the others who you can't see. But thank you so much. It has been such an interesting and thought-provoking conversation. But please, for anyone who can stay, do. We've got another few questions to go, but thank you.
Thanks for that. I just, for the first time, jumped into the Slido and went, oh, wow, there's a lot of questions. So I think post-finishing, can the Slidos stay open for a bit? Because I wouldn't mind, I could perhaps reply to some individually after I've had a cup of tea and get back to them, yeah. But I'm happy to, I'm certainly okay for another quarter of an hour or so. Yep.
I'm going to have to go in a couple of minutes, Sarah.
All right. Well,
So,
any pressing ones for Laura? Take your now is the moment. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Slido will stay open. So if there are any further questions, I think Sarah can answer them later.
Yeah.
I've got one here from Kate. A little bit more practical. How do we, as women, carers, early career researchers, other groups, advocate for more support, time and resources when higher ed resourcing is plummeting at the moment, and especially, you know, the situation in Australia?
That's I think we need to organise. So, you know, the level of organisation you feel comfortable with really is very super personal. I'm a member of the union because I just feel that to be something bigger than myself is important right at the moment. And as someone who has recently been made redundant, I totally get that. And I do think there are pendulums and swings, and there are some times in history when it is really hard. But I'm also seeing conversations in the Northern Hemisphere about some very experienced academics seriously considering alternative kinds of institutions, micro institutions with different kinds of offerings and more radical curricula that could be a kind of island of alternative practice. So I think that there are going to be different islands of radical alternative practice that people may be able to join. And I can't predict how and the timelines for those sorts of things. So I think sometimes we need to join and connect in ways that can keep our energy and start to form some medium-term plans if we cannot make things happen right in the moment. So yeah, keeping hopeful in difficult times is I think a community issue and ones that you just need to get together with people and find the natural entrepreneurs and innovators that you can, if you know, that maybe you know, that you might feel buoyed to take a step that's quite different, or you might be someone that can join a project that someone like that is doing. So I think you need to find your people and find those hopeful projects. I know that Hawaii is the only nation in the universe who has adopted a feminist-led approach to the economic recovery plan for their whole economy post-COVID. So I'm telling you, this thing's got legs. It was a grounds up and top down thing happened over there. So there are some places where it is not entirely horrible. And we must remember that it doesn't have to be the way it is. So you just have to keep organising and connecting.
Maybe I'll let me, if I do have to go because it's the beginning of my working day. But I just want to say two things. The one is, I think it's incumbent on the few of us, the diminishing lot of us who still have permanent positions in academia, to take up the cudgels and speak constantly about the austerity environment and the precariat. Because one of the problems of a growing precariat is it's much more difficult to take on these acts of resistance when the next job is at risk. So I think that this alliance between this notion of this kind of central core of permanent academics and everyone else has got to be broken up. It's got to, we can't have that anymore. And this is actually something everyone's got to do together. And then I'm going to end by putting into the Slido the link to a paper that I've just been involved with, which is about COVID and inequality. But one of the things that we did, I don't know where to put it actually, I'm just going to put it at the top and one of you can decide. But one of the things that we did is we wrote collaboratively, and one of my colleagues insisted on writing a paragraph at the end about hope. And how does one manage hope in this impossible, traumatic horror of a world that we live in? And in fact, one of the reviewers said, this is not appropriate for an academic paper. And we recommend that this is removed. And we said to the editor that we felt very strongly that it should be included. So we changed it to acknowledge that this was a personal note, but this colleague of mine simply wrote it as is, and we've kept it. And it's about the contradictions and the impossibilities and the inevitability of hope. So I have included that there, and I think from my point, that's what I'd like to end with. So thank you very much. I'm going to get back to my working day, and thanks for those of you who came at the end of your working day to be part of this event. And please talk to us on Twitter.
Thank you so much, Laura. So lovely for me to see your face again and hear your voice. Enjoy your day.
And thanks to your fabulous team who's at Cradle for organizing everything here.
Absolutely. I'll say a pleasure, but I didn't do that much. Tweet the hell out of it.
Thank you, everyone.
See you.
Bye.
There you have it. The amazing Laura Czerniewicz. A joy to collaborate with, and I think I found in Laura one of those my people. So it was, I approached Laura at the end of Hertzer in 2015 or 16. It was in Adelaide about this project. So yeah, it was great that we managed
doing that.
Yeah, I think it must have been 16 or 17, actually, early in the PhD when I was like really, oh God, it must have been 17 when I was heavily writing in social justice theory and felt it was so hard to find anything published. That was sort of what drove me absolutely bonkers. So I just thought, this is ridiculous. This is so under, why, you know, the conversations are being happened, but they're not being converted into more rigorous papers that can be cited and then, you know, leveraged. So kind of set about on an ambition, on a sort of a project to rectify that lack of representation of that particular strong set of ideas in the educational literature. Such a lot of technology-based edtech, as you'd be aware. So it was really great that she was so enthusiastic from the get-go.
Joe, I don't know whether there are any questions, or shall we wrap it up? I think there's only one by Yuso.
I think Yuso's question got a response earlier.
Okay.
Laura paid reference to it already.
Cool.
So I think everyone's just saying thank you, and yeah.
Lovely.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Sarah.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for your comments.
And my reading list has just grown by 10 more, like fold, not just 10 articles.
That's the danger, isn't it? You open a crack on a new piece of lit. But I think you know, your reflection from the perspective of being an editor, the editorial we wrote is probably the most succinct, you know, because it does actually look at those processes and the outcomes in that particular way. But yeah, I'm really keen to join up with people who might have some ideas for where we can do more of this, and I'm obviously super keen to participate.
Which is a great point to say to everyone, thank you for joining us. And Sarah is available if you want to drop her an email, ask any more questions. You can get in touch with any of us and we can pass you on to Sarah or email her direct. And
That's
we
right.
are always available as well.
And keep your eyes out for any paid editing jobs, people. Let's put it out there. That would be amazing. All right. Thank you so much, Paige, Joe, and Rolla. Lovely to speak today. And thank you everyone again for coming. Ciao for now.
Bye.